Muted there. Good to see you.
Good morning.
All right.
Morning, pastors. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Good morning. Okay. Let me adjust everything. Here we go. All right. Well, like I told you a moment ago, you know, with this diagram we see every session just about. But on this diagram, as I mentioned before, we skipped the first three steps when we studied the Psalms, the Psalms passage, because again, as the Psalms is a collection of independent poems. So we focused our attention just on the poem, but not on the book as a whole, because the book of Psalms is unique in the Bible in that it's the only book that's not really a book. It's not like there's one guy who wrote all the Psalms and he had a flow of thought and he had a overall purpose, but it's actually each Psalm is a poem in itself, and each poem has its own purpose and its own occasion, and there are several different authors. And so that book, the Psalms, is unique among the books of the Bible in that way. Now, Proverbs is a little bit like that in that there are parts of it that is a collection of Proverbs, but most of them are written by the same author, and the book of Proverbs is a book. And Solomon, who's the author, is put them together, collected them together, and there's an intention, there's an occasion. And actually, in the first part of Proverbs, there is a flow of thought. So I'll get to that as we go along here together. But what I wanted to do was, as I mentioned a moment ago, is I'm going to take an extra week and just have us review those first three steps in this process, the first three steps of the exegetical process, because we skipped them last time, but we're going to need to go over them for this time. And so with that, what that means is that we're going to push out the due dates a little bit. So I know you're always happy about that. So that'll give us an extra week. I'll show you at the end of our session today, sort of the new schedule. All right. But as I mentioned, Proverbs, like every other book of the Bible except Psalms, is written as a book with a specific purpose. There is a flow of thought, especially in the first 9 chapters of the book. And like I said, it's primarily by one author. There may be a couple of other authors that were also included in the book. There's debates among scholars about that, but generally most of the book of Proverbs, if not all, are authored by Solomon. And we'll talk about that as well as we go forward. But as I mentioned to you before, what we did when we studied our Psalms is we just started on step number 4, where we actually focus in on the passage. But because now we're in the book of Proverbs, we're going to need to do the first 3 steps of the book. And the first step, as we have discussed with narratives, we discussed with epistles, we need to read and observe the book, and in this case, the whole book. Okay? So I just want to spend a few minutes and talk about that. All right, reading the book. Reading books of the Bible is a lost art, I think, among preachers. Oftentimes, right, we have a passage that we have to preach next week, and so we focus our attention on just the verses that we're going to preach, and oftentimes we'll skip or just do very little work on looking at the book as a whole. But that's a very risky process, and there are some reasons why we want to get familiar with the entire book. And let me just throw that out to you guys as a question. Let me ask you, what would be the value in trying to get an understanding of the book as a whole before you study a particular passage within the book? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? What would be the advantage or value or benefit to looking at reading the whole book, getting familiar with the book as a whole before studying a particular verse or set of verses?
To know the authorial intent, Pastor Tim.
To get the authorial
know
intent?
Yeah.
And how will that help us find the author's intent?
I think it will safeguard us in our interpretation, that we would
not be out of context in the way we interpret the passage that we are going to preach. Uh, I think that's one great advantage if we would really study the book as a whole.
Yeah, good. It'll help us understand the context, the author's flow of thought, so that we don't take something out of context when we study. Good. Anything else?
Yeah, maybe Pastor Tim, on a on a superficial level as well, we can be able to see the structure, how the author um, sequence the, let's say, the stories, the events, or if there are admonition, series of admonition, something like that.
Yeah, that's really good. It helps us see there's a structure. Like I said, that's the feature of a book. There's always a structure to a book, and it's an intentional structure. Even the Psalms, the people that collected them later and ordered them tried to give them structure as well. They would group Psalms together with similar themes or the same author. So it's interesting how our minds work. We want structure, and every book of the Bible is that way. There is an order to it, and we need to know that order or that structure if we're going to understand something within the particular book. Good. Any other thoughts that come to your mind? The advantages of reading a whole book, of getting familiar with the book as a whole before focusing on one part?
Maybe, Pastor Tim, so that you can see the the occasion or the purpose of the author as a
Good.
whole,
Yes.
the point of his writing.
Yes.
That,
I'm sorry, keep going.
that's all, Pastor Tim.
No, that's a great point. It'll help us know why did he write this book? What motivated him to write? What's the purpose of it? What's the message he's trying to get across? And sometimes the author tells us that explicitly, but most of the time the author doesn't say it directly. But when we know the book well enough, we can identify that purpose. Now, in the book of Proverbs, the author was explicit. He tells us exactly why he wrote the book, what his focus was, what his purpose was. So that's good, and we'll see that as we go forward. So good, yeah. Now the first step is in this process, and again, if you'll notice, the first 3 steps focus on the book. Notice that I say read and observe the book, background context of the book, contextual flow of the book. So we're looking at this from the high level, the 10,000 meter level. Step 4 and following, we're looking at the 1 meter level. We're focusing on a narrow part. But what we want to do first for every book, again, except the Psalms, is get a big picture view. And so the first step in doing that is, it is an obvious one, but like I said, it's one that's often not considered or carried out, and that is to read the book, but read the entire book. Don't just read your passage or maybe read the chapter. You've got to read the whole book, and you got to read it several times. Why is that? What would by reading the book several times, what will that help us with? Why would that be an important thing to do instead of just reading one time or just reading a part of the book? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I guess first it would be reinforcement of what you may have learned, and likewise a clarification of what you have learned.
Yeah, good. Any others? The advantages of reading the whole book and reading it more than once. Any other thoughts?
You will understand the passage more, and at the same time, if there are things you've missed during the first reading, you will be able to see it the second, the third, the fourth time.
Yep. Yeah, it really helps in that way. I'm sorry, someone else? I heard someone say something.
For familiarization's sake, Pastor Tim.
Yeah,
You get to be familiar with the text.
yeah, just to get familiar with the book. I don't know if I've mentioned to you guys this, but I really learned this lesson the hard way when I was preaching through Jonah. I really didn't get familiar with I mean, I knew the story generally, right? We all know the general story of Jonah, but I didn't study the book as a whole, but just sort of focused on, I taught each chapter. And then when I got to chapter 4, that's when I realized what the purpose of the book was. And that's not when you want to realize it after you've already preached, most of the book. You want to know the purpose of the book and its flow at the beginning. So that just was a good lesson for me to, like, I need to read this, read the book several times and get familiar with the book. And then, even as Brother Norell mentions here, just it'll internalize the thought of the book itself. It'll help us to really understand and get familiar with the book. But more than just getting familiar with the book is to, how can I? Well, I guess it's getting familiar. I mean, you know what's there, but also you start seeing patterns or things come to your mind that as you're reading, if you read the whole book several times and you go back through, you're like, you know what? He talks about this toward the end of the book too. Or I see this word or this kind of word used a lot, or maybe if it's a narrative, there's certain things like in Genesis, what should stick out to you in Genesis? One of many things, but one of the interesting things, and it struck me, I'm reading through the Bible, in the year, and I'm in Genesis and was reading about Isaac when he lied about Rebekah and said he was his sister. Now, that wasn't the only time in Genesis that happened, right? His dad, Abraham, did the same thing twice. So 3 times in Genesis, we have, one of the patriarchs lying about his wife, saying that she's his sister, putting his wife in a very bad situation, right? So I thought that's kind of interesting. Why would that particular account be repeated 3 times in the book? Is there something that Moses, who's the author, wants us to see? But, if you don't read the whole book several times, things like that won't stick out to you. So I think it's helpful to get familiar with the book. It really is it's the easiest step in the whole process, right? To read. I mean, this is the easiest part, but I think it can yield a lot of benefit. The more familiar you are with the book, it so much will help the next steps. A lot, and it will really ingrain the book in your mind. And if you're preaching through the book, it will, other parts of the book will come to you as you're preaching a particular passage, and it'll just all sort of connect together the more familiar you are with the book. Oftentimes, especially in a larger book, you'll be using other parts of the book for illustration and cross-referencing and things like that, because the author will often say or repeat certain key things going through the book. So getting familiar with the book is very important. Gordon Fee said this about reading through a whole book. You need a provisional sense of the whole before analyzing any of its parts, and you gain such a sense by reading it through. So again, we need to understand and get a feel and for the whole book before looking at its parts. It's like a puzzle. When you do a puzzle, we don't just dump the pieces out and then just start trying to build a puzzle. It'll take you forever to do that. What's the first thing you do with a puzzle? Right? You look at, what's that?
Analyzed.
Yeah.
You
look at
the pattern.
The whole picture, right? So that usually the picture's on the box. And then you say, okay, that's the big picture. That's what it looks like overall. You need to know that first before you start looking at each piece, because then you'll know better how each piece fits together. And it's really very similar in studying a book of the Bible, a passage of the Bible. to really know how that passage fits and where it goes and how it connects, you need to know the whole story. And so this first step of reading gives us a sense of that. So I would say first, read the whole book and read it several times and read it in different translations. Okay. Now, why might I suggest that? What do you think might be some advantages to reading it in different translations? Any ideas?
Mm,
When
So
you,
we can
oh, go ahead.
so we can get to find out and also know the other translations of, especially of important words and important aspects, and well, not just the literal meaning of the words, because we are not familiar with the original Hebrew text. So that when we read through the different translations, we can have a better understanding of what it really is saying.
Yep, good. That's a helpful insight. Any others that come to mind in addition to that?
To compare the words in every translation that you use.
Okay. Now, by doing that, what is happening then? Let's say you've read the book in one translation several times. Okay, NAS or ESV or perhaps Cebuano, whatever translation you read mostly, and then you read it in another translation. Guess what's going to happen? If you're familiar with it in the translation you've been reading, if you read it in another translation, sometimes things are going to stick out like that's a little different than what I remember that I read before. What this does, and it's just a simple reason, actually. I recommend you read it in other translations because that will keep your mind active. If you read it in the same translation over and over and over and over and over and over, right? You'll start sort of, the temptation is to not really be thinking, just reading. But if you read it, if you read it in other translations, that will often keep your mind active because you're noticing some differences. So the point isn't to study those differences yet. I mean, that will come later. But what it does is it sort of keeps our mind active because that's the key. The best type of reading is active reading, not passive reading. Okay, you know what I mean by that? Passive reading is just sort of, you're seeing the words as they go across the page, but you're not really thinking about them. You're just sort of going through the exercise, kind of like watching a movie or something. That's a passive thing. But what we want to do is be as active as possible when we read, to be thinking about what we're reading. And so reading in different translations will help do that. And also making observations, observing the book will help us do that. Observing the book is an active reading. Okay. Once you've read through a few times, then I recommend you go back and just make general observations as you read through the next time. And those observations, this is a very important skill. Howard Hendricks talked about this. What makes one person a better Bible student than another? He can see more. That's all. The same truth is available to both of them. The only difference between them is what either one can see in a cubic foot of space, meaning all of us are presented with the same passage, same book. But how much do you notice? How much do you see? How active are you in reading that particular portion of scripture? John MacArthur said, Extended time in observation is a must for an expositor. He must resist the temptation to plunge immediately into commentaries and other study helps. Nothing can replace firsthand observation. Okay, so not only should we be reading through our passage and the book several times to get familiar with it, but also after you're familiar with it, write down or take note of observations, things that you notice from the passage, okay, or from the book, sorry, as a whole. And those, I sort of put these in two categories: that make some specific observations, that is, as you're reading, look for some specific things, and then secondly, make some general observations, okay? So, for example, make some specific observations. These are certain things that we should just automatically be looking for as we're reading a book of the Bible. As we're getting to prepare to study for. Who's the author? What's his tone? Who's the audience? The people mentioned, the places. And again, these will be things that we do for the background context, but it's good to have our minds thinking about them as we're reading. So this is what a process that I would do. Normally what I do, if I'm going to study a book, let's say I'm going to study, well, I'm looking at, say the book of Titus. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the book in my normal translation. And for me, that's the New American Standard. And I'll read it, I'll read it once a day, usually for about, one week or so. And I'm just reading it. And if it's a small book like Titus, I'll read it actually a couple times a day for about a week. I'm just getting familiar with it. And then what I'll do is, then I'll read in once or twice in other translations. So I might take a few days. I'll read it, say, in the ESV. I'll read the NIV. I might read the New King James. Sometimes I might read the Net Bible or the Holman Bible. I'm starting to read that more. And so I'll read that a few times in those translations, and then I'll make observations. I'll read again in New American Standard, and I'll make observations. And first I'll make the specific ones that I just mentioned. And I've already been thinking about this. I'm already pretty familiar with the book, because by this time I've read it maybe 15 times or 20 times. And so I'll already know who the author is, but I'll take note of that. Author, the recipients, any repeated words that I see, things like that, okay? And then what I'll do is I'll read through the book again a few times, making general observations. And this can be anything that comes to your mind, anything that you notice, any kinds of questions that you have from the book as a whole. Okay, and I'll just take, what I'll do is usually I'll go one chapter at a time for 30 minutes. And I'll just write down all my observations, all my questions, anything that I see, like I said, looking maybe if there's some things that are repeated or things that I notice, like maybe, Paul seems to focus on leaders at the beginning of the letter, but then the middle of the letter, he focuses on the congregation. And then the end of the letter is more doctrinal. And so just, again, any kind of thing that you notice. And then sometimes I might remember or go back to the other translations if things stuck out to me as far as maybe a different word used or something like that. Okay. All right. So like I said, this step is an easy step. It's just reading and noting things. It's a very easy step to do, but it takes a little time. And I think that's why we often don't do it or don't do it thoroughly, but it can yield. It's like, I don't know if any of you are gardeners, but a lot of times you want to prepare the soil ahead of time, right? Before you put seed in, before you put the plant in, and you want to put fertilizer, you want to loosen up the soil, you want to pull weeds and other plants out. there's a preparation. And the better you prepare the soil, the more likely that your plant is going to grow and be healthy and yield fruit. Well, it's the same in our study of Scripture. The more we prepare the soil by reading, getting familiar with the book, the better we're going to be able, or more prepared we will be for the following steps in the process. All right. So this is really a great way to increase or enhance what you learn in the following steps as you study a book. All right. Is to really work at reading, to get familiar with the book, and then making observations from the book. Are there any questions or comments on that, this part? Anything come to your mind?
Sir Tim, in every chapter, we make a general observation, the whole book.
That's how I do it. That's what I recommend. Because then I'm thinking about every chapter. Now on bigger books, you know, like a gospel or something, this could take a while. So sometimes with a bigger book, I may only take 10 minutes a chapter, you know, or something like that. There's no rule about it. It's just I want to try to get familiar with the book. So, you know, Pastor MacArthur, even on the Gospels or the bigger books, he's still his goal before he starts studying a book, he reads it 30 times, 30. Even like the Gospels. So he'll read, when he studied the Gospel of John recently or preached through it, he read it 30 times before he started studying it. So that's a lot. That's a lot of reading. But, you know, by that time, you're very familiar. If you've been reading actively, you're very familiar with the book. And it really, really helps when you're studying a specific part of the book. But yeah, for me, the observation step, it just helps me to be more active and thinking about the book and looking for connections, or if I have questions. So I try to do it a chapter at a time. You know, and like I said, the shorter the book, the more time I'll spend on observations. I just finished 3rd John, which is just one chapter, and I spent probably 45 minutes just making observations of that letter, because it's just one chapter, but I spent a lot more time on it. And these are my observations. You know, I don't go and look at other books or commentaries yet and see what they observe. This is just what I'm seeing from it, because that's the most active, is when I'm thinking about it myself. Any other questions? All right. Well, let's go to the second. Let's see here. We've already talked about that. Okay. The second step, again, looking at the book as a whole. And that is, notice actually the second and the third steps focus on context. And we've discussed this in class many times, but I thought, again, it would be helpful to remind us in preparation for this first assignment in Proverbs, where we're going to be, the assignment is to do the background context of the book and also the contextual flow or literary context. So as I mentioned earlier, not all of you guys were here, but I mentioned earlier is that I want to take 2 weeks to go through these to review. So you're going to have a little extra time to do this first assignment. So that's my New Year's, Happy New Year to you, is you're going to get a little extra time to finish it. All right. So today my desire is we'll just focus on the background context and talk about that. And then next week we'll look at the contextual flow. And then talk about Proverbs specifically in regards to that. Okay. But so you don't have the read and observe, that step. I didn't give you an assignment for that, but I would recommend that you be reading through Proverbs several times, especially those first 9 chapters, because your passage is going to be from those first 9 chapters. And there really is those first 9 chapters are connected together. There's a flow of thought. There's a particular theme, And if you notice how chapter 1 begins and how chapter 9 ends, there really is a unit there. So you really want to be familiar with Proverbs 1 to 9 especially. Now, Proverbs 10 to 29 are those short proverbial statements. So there's really not a structure there as far as a flow of thought. They're just sort of a collection. But those first 9 chapters, I recommend you read those through several times and then make observations. Okay, but there's no assignment for that, but I would encourage you to do that. And then the second step would be to and then this will be an assignment for you, is to identify the background context of the book. Now, if we remember from context, there are 3 rules of interpretation, right? This is a classic statement. Context is the first rule. The second rule is context. And the third rule is context. And all that means is just emphasizing, making sure that we understand the emphasis and the importance of the context of a book. Now, if you'll remember, when we talk about context, there's two types of context that we are referring to. Okay, and what are those two types of context? Can anybody tell me?
Immediate context.
Okay, immediate context. What else?
Book context.
Say again.
Book
The book.
context.
Okay. The book context. Yeah, when we've looked at and studied in our own study, when we talk about context, there's a lot of ways to look at it. I've sort of categorized it or put it in 2 categories. There's one kind of context, which is the background context, I call it, and that's the setting of the book. That has to do with sort of when the book was written, why it was written, to whom it was written, what time period was it written in, what prompted the writing of the book, those kind of things. That's what's called a background context. Okay.
Culture.
Yeah, the culture, that's part of it. What culture was this written in? What were some of the common practices of that culture? That kind of thing. The second type of context is there's a few different terms. So the first type, let me just write this down. Background. And that we could say that's the setting of the book, basically. It's the who, the when, the where, the culture, those kind of things. The second kind of context is there's a few, we've called it the literary context, or some people call it the surrounding context. We're also going to refer to it as the contextual flow. All right. And that is actually the actual words within the book and how they are put together. Okay. So when we talk about context, there's 2 kinds that we have to make sure we understand. There's the background, that is the setting of the writing, and then there's the writing itself. Okay, we need to understand both of those in order to understand the context of a particular passage, all right? And so we're going to focus our attention today on the background context, and then next week we'll look at the literary context. And then for your assignment from Proverbs is to do both of those for the book of Proverbs. And I'll give you a big hint. Actually, in the notes for the class, in the teacher's manual, there's a section on Proverbs that'll have a lot of information that'll help you with this, okay, for that book. So I think I've already mentioned that to you. I posted a format for this assignment that I'll also go over with you next week. All right. But when we talk about context, we're talking about two types, background and literary. All right. So the step number 2 is looking at the background context of the book. All right. Let's see. Let me have Brother Ruel. Can you read this paragraph for us?
A key principle for expository preaching. Something's blocking. I cannot read it.
Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead.
What is blocking?
Can
Yeah.
you see it now?
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry
A
about
key
that.
principle for expository preaching is that before we can say what a text means to our hearers, we must first understand what a text meant to the original hearers. Thus, before preaching a passage, we must first do the exegesis to uncover the author's intended meaning.
Okay. So this is a guiding hermeneutic for us for all that we've been studying, right? Before we know what a text can say, what a text means, we have to know what it meant. And the best way to uncover the author's intended meaning is to enter into his world. That is, try to understand as best as we can who is writing, why did he write, who is he writing to, what prompted him to write, what's the reason that the book was written, what places are mentioned in the book, what people are mentioned in the book, any historical events, what's the culture. These are all part of, the better we understand this background, the better we're going to understand the writer when he says something. For example, if a person, let's say you contacted a friend of yours, and let's say it's a friend of yours, and he says, "I'm very sick." Okay, now, would it help you to understand him better if you learned that he was in the hospital? Then that would tell you he is very sick. Or what if he was just at home and he was resting in bed all day? Would there be a difference maybe and when he says I'm very sick, if he's in the hospital in the ICU versus just resting at home? Right? There'd be a little difference in, you would understand in one situation, it's serious, right? He's in the ICU at the hospital. The other situation, he's not feeling well. He's staying home. Maybe he's not able to work that day. But knowing his background helps us understand what he's saying a little better. Okay. Now, sometimes, like in English, the younger generation uses that word sick to mean like something that's really interesting or neat. Like if they see a guy do some particular trick, they'll say, "Oh, that was sick, man." You know, like I don't know. Have you heard that term in the Philippines? Do the young people use that there? Yeah. So if you found out that the person saying "I'm very sick" was actually a teenager and he was at some rock concert, he could be just talking about how, awesome the band is. Oh, I'm very sick, man. So you have to understand who's speaking and in what situation is he speaking to know what he's saying. And it could be the exact same words, right? The exact same words, but the way they're being used and the meaning behind them is affected by knowing the author's background, the situation. All right. And so that's why it's important that, like, for example, in Philippians, Paul talks a lot about rejoice in the Lord. I'm full of joy. And, when you understand that he is in prison, that takes on a much more powerful meaning, doesn't it? To hear him expressing his joy, even in very difficult circumstances. Okay. So all of that to say is the best way for the expositor to uncover the author's meaning is to try to enter that author's world and understand the author's situation and the recipients to whom he is speaking. That will give us insight as to what he means by what he says. All right. And so that's why we have this second step of studying the background context. Let me see if I can get John, if you could please read what's on the screen here, both paragraphs, please.
Okay. Before understanding specific words or verses, we must take into account the larger background of the speaker's situation and how that affects what he intends to communicate to the reader or hearer. Since God spoke his message in specific historical situations, wait, I'm sorry, my internet's
Oh,
making it blurry.
no, that was my fault.
Okay. Since God spoke his message in specific historical situations, i.e., to people living in particular places, speaking particular languages, adopting a particular way of life, we should take the ancient historical, cultural, it's blurry again. There. We
Sorry
should
about that.
take the ancient historical, cultural situation seriously. This leads us to a crucial interpretive principle. For our interpretation of any biblical text to be valid, it must be consistent with the historical, cultural context of that text. If our interpretation would not have made sense back then, we are probably on the wrong track. Duval and Hayes, Grasping
Okay.
God's Way.
Thank you. So that's sort of a, basically a long way to say we need to know the author's situation as best we can, because it is from that situation and from those circumstances and from where he lives and when he lives and his culture that is where we understand the meaning. Like I said, that word sick. In my generation, older generations, we use it to refer to our health, but in the younger generations, they also use that word to talk about something that was really, really amazing. Okay. And so we have to understand the background of the author, of the speaker. That will help us to better understand what's being said. And that's why in the poem, when we did the poetry, we studied the setting of the poem, right? What prompted that poem to be written? Who wrote it? Or at least what was the author's situation? What was his tone? Do we know who he wrote it to? Or any places mentioned, any people mentioned? Those kinds of things give us that insight into the author's world, and that background will help us. Okay? And so that's sort of the motivation, and generally speaking, what is background context? To understand that, basically the background context then is to look at each of several categories to identify information in each of those categories to help us understand the background. Okay. Now, again, this is a review of what we talked about in the first module early on. And so hopefully some of this will just be by way of review. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I just want to acquaint you with this, because you're going to need to do it for your Proverbs passage, because again, Proverbs is a book with a particular purpose, with a primary author, and with a structure. So to better understand the author, we want to understand his background as best we can. All right. And with that, we're going to look at several categories that we want to identify and study and understand. We get the background context. Now, before we start on this, there are several helpful resources that give some of this information. Probably the most helpful ones that I can think of as far as resources for background context Might be like the MacArthur Study Bible has helpful notes. Tom Constable, his notes that you can get online. Probably the best book that I highly recommend you try to get access to if you can is Talk Through the Bible by Wilkinson and Boa. And I know that Living Word has this book in the library. And then commentaries, commentaries will often have introduction at the beginning. Now, what I'm encouraging you to do, though, is don't look at these yet, all right? Is do the work yourself first, and then you can refer to these resources to get more information. Because again, the more you study on your own, the more you're going to remember, the more it's going to help you as you're studying, because that's the most active approach to this, is to find out that information yourself rather than reading it somewhere else. The more active role you play in studying the book, the more you're going to remember it and the more it will help you understand it. Okay. There's nothing wrong with going to resources. And I know they help and they can help save time, but again, I recommend to do this as much as you can on your own. Now, when you're studying a book, if you're teaching through the whole book, you only have to do this once at the beginning. You don't have to study the background context every passage in the same book, right? You just have to do this at the beginning. So keep that in mind.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
I have a question. It's need to, especially the author and the questionable author writings. It's need to give a preach also in the congregation, especially Second Peter. There's a lot of question. Who's the author? Who write this? The Second Peter. There's a lot of. It's important to also to preach to the congregation.
Preach what? Who the author is, or
who's the author? The content. What you mean is the questionable writing, because many question the Second Peter. It's Peter who writes.
Yeah, so
If
basic. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's need to include in your preaching introduction or in the background.
Well, if we know the author, then yeah, it's helpful to mention him. Some books we don't know the author, and we never will until heaven. Some books there is maybe some questions about a particular author, maybe like Second Peter. Now, in Second Peter's case, though, because most manuscripts begin with Simon Peter, I think we need to take that at face value. But I believe Peter wrote that because it says that he does at the beginning. And, most epistles, every epistle except John's epistles and Hebrews starts out with the author's name. That's a very common practice in epistles. So when you see an epistle and the author's name is there, you can bet that that's actually was on the original because that was common practice. Now, liberal scholars will try to say, well, there were other people and they called pseudonyms where it was not, Paul didn't write this letter, it was somebody else, but he put Paul's name. Let me just say, if somebody says that, ignore it. That's my simple response.
Thank you.
Okay, because we believe in an inerrant scripture, and if the text has the particular author's name, that's who wrote it. Okay, and we can go into a long discussion about textual criticism. I'd be happy to maybe another time answer some questions on that. But like, for example, I mean, there's just many examples of this. Liberal criticism has attacked the authenticity of books, like the book of Daniel, for example. Many claim Daniel didn't write that. A lot of attacks because there's so many miracles described in the book of Daniel, and they don't want to acknowledge that those happened. And so be careful with that. Now, there are many books, though, like the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark. They don't have the specific author's name. Well, none of the Gospels have the author's name in it by the author, but Luke and John in particular, we can figure that out internally. And then Matthew and Mark, we accept what the early church fathers have handed down to us as far as the authors there. Hebrews, we don't know who wrote that book. There's a lot of arguments about Paul wrote it or Apollos wrote it. Some say Luke could have written it, but nobody knows for sure. There are many books in the Old Testament. We just don't know for sure who wrote it. We do know who wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? Who wrote those 5 books?
Moses.
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 Now, what's that? Moses, right? Jesus called them the books of Moses. All right, so I'm going to go with what Jesus said. Now, there are some liberal scholars that say, oh, no, Moses didn't write those, but he did. That's what Scripture tells us. Now, the book of Judges, the book of Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. We're not exactly sure who wrote those books. All right, there's theories. Perhaps Judges, Samuel could have been written by Samuel. Chronicles could have been written by Ezra. So sometimes we don't know for sure who the author is, but we can still learn a lot about the author's tone or about when the book was written or to whom it was written. We can still figure out a lot of information, even if we don't know the author explicitly. Okay, so it helps if we do know who the author is, but some books we don't have that information, and so we have to take that as from the Lord that for this particular book, not knowing the specific author, we can still understand what the author was saying. But the more we know about the author, the better. And in many books, we do know who the specific author is. All right, but just be careful with discussions about the author, especially in books where the author does say explicitly who he is. All right. Ephesians is another example. A lot of attacks on Ephesians. Oh, Paul didn't write that book. And there's a lot of reasons they give. He uses words in that book he doesn't use in other books, or things like that. But the first word in the letter to the Ephesians is Paul. And so, and every manuscript has that. So I'm not going to reject what's plainly on the text for, the reasons that are given. But sort of back to your question, Kent. If a book expresses who the author is explicitly, then you can trust that and mention that, that Peter wrote this particular book, and this is the second letter that he wrote to focus on this particular topic. But some books like Hebrews, I don't know who the author is, so I don't try to answer that question. But the author does have a certain tone in that book, and the author does have a particular audience that he's focused on. So those are things we can learn from the book. A long answer to a short question, but is that helpful? Do you have any other?
Yes, Pastor Tim, it's helpful.
Okay. Any other questions along those lines, guys, while we're on this? It's just like in the Psalms. Many of the Psalms we know the author, but some of them we don't. But that's okay, because as you study the Psalm, you can still identify the situation of the author or the tone of the author, or why he wrote that particular poem. So there's still a lot of information we can get from the passage, even if we don't know the author explicitly. But when we do, that helps a lot. So here are just some guiding questions as you're doing the background context and you're looking at the author. Just some guiding questions to consider. Reading the book several times. There's things within the book you can learn about the author, especially for the epistles, but even for some of the other books. And then there's also, if you know who the author is, then there are other passages. Like, for example, who's the author of Proverbs? We'll give you an answer to your question.
Majority,
Solomon.
Solomon,
majority
right?
King Solomon.
Yes.
Lemuel.
All right, who said that?
Jesse.
All right. Yeah. And how do we know that Solomon is the author? Well,
Verse 1.
verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon. And even just to make sure we understand which Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. That's pretty explicit, right? That's pretty direct. That's pretty clear. And then even, I think, notice Proverbs 10, the Proverbs of Solomon. And it's interesting here, and as you look, as we study the structure of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters of Proverbs are these extended poems, like they're chapter long. And so it seems as if Solomon, when he first formed the book of Proverbs, he put those 9 chapters together. And then in chapter 10, there's a shift from these long extended poems to these short, what are called aphorism. Here's a fancy word. An aphorism is a 2-line proverb, right? An apple a day keeps the doctor away. That's called an aphorism. It's just a fancy way to say, you know, a proverbial statement that's usually, you know, 2 or 3 lines. Okay. And so Proverbs 1 through 9 are structured by these extended, I call them extended poems. They're all like a chapter in length. Okay. With a particular theme. They're just kind of like a psalm. And then Proverbs 10 through like 29, I think, are these aphorisms. It maybe 28. I can't remember now. All right. And then when we get to the latter chapters, you know, chapter 30 and chapter 31, we're back to these extended poem. Okay. And I think some wise guy said King Lemuel, right? So he's in chapter 31, but actually it's his mother. And some think Lemuel was just another name that Solomon used for himself. We don't know for sure, but there's an argument could be made. But what's interesting is, and the reason I'm bringing this up is notice at the beginning of chapter 10, Solomon again identifies himself as the author. And that actually it's a structural marker because it's telling us chapters 1 to 9 were these extended poems. And then chapter 10, it's still the same author, but now he's going to give us a collection of these aphorisms that he wrote. Okay. And so he's sort of, I think, identifying this next section in his book by restating the fact that he is the author. Now, there's another section. If we go back, I don't remember the exact verse. In, chapter 25, where notice it says, these also are the Proverbs of Solomon. And it appears that, it says in the book of 2 Kings that First Kings, that Solomon wrote like over 3,000 Proverbs. I don't remember the verse.
Yes, chapter 4, verse 29.
Oh, great. Thank you. Oops.
Oh,
29.
32.
Here you go. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. All right. So
That's
I guess
because that's my, I read that 33, Pastor T. I have, I ask you this question. If he literally spoke to the trees,
he spoke to the trees.
verse
Oh,
33.
he spoke of trees. He's talked
Uh,
about trees. He didn't talk to
trees.
trees.
Okay, thank you.
That's what the Druids did, you know, the tree worshipers. They talked to the trees. So did so did Gandalf, right? He talked to the trees, right, in Lord of the Rings. But
Yes.
Solomon, he spoke of the trees. All right. He spoke of animals. So it's just describing Solomon's wisdom extended to nature. And that's why when the Queen of Sheba visited him, she asked him questions about all kinds of different things, not just spiritual things, but also about nature, about animals, this kind of thing. Notice he talked about the hyssop. So this guy had a lot of knowledge. All right. Anyway, he spoke 3,000 proverbs, but not all of those proverbs are in the book of Proverbs. So apparently, only some of those proverbs were inspired. Okay. And if you look at Proverbs, like I said, Proverbs 1, it begins with Solomon identifies himself as the author. And then, like I said, chapters 1 to 9 is sort of these extended poems that are a chapter long. And then in chapter 10, the type of Proverbs shifts from these extended poems to these aphorisms. But again, Solomon notes himself as the author. But when we get to chapter 25, it appears that there were other Proverbs of Solomon that were collected by the men of Hezekiah. These were scribes in Hezekiah's day that identified several other Proverbs written by Solomon and collected them, added them onto the book of Proverbs. And again, these are aphorisms. But seeing again that there's a change in structure. And so again, the author of Solomon is noted. Okay. And then there's more aphorisms until we get to, let me just find which chapter. Is it 29? Okay, 30. The words of Agur. So this might be another author that was later added on, perhaps by Hezekiah or someone else. Some make an argument that this is a pseudonym for Solomon. I don't think it is, but that's another discussion. But I just wanted you to, knowing that most of the Proverbs, the book of Proverbs was written by Solomon, is very helpful because we know a lot about Solomon from other books, right? We know about Solomon from the book of First Kings. Specifically, we know about Solomon from the book of Ecclesiastes, right? Here, he calls himself the preacher, the son of David. All right. So here we have a clue. Whoever wrote this was the son of David and was a king in Jerusalem, right? And then he refers to himself in other parts of the letter. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. All right. And then I think later in, let's see, forget where Solomon's name is mentioned specifically. Let me just cheat. Oh, I guess he's still the preacher. So we surmise from that Solomon wrote. Of course, there's the Song of Songs, which Solomon wrote. So we have other books of the Bible which give us some information about Solomon, particularly First Kings. All right, so that's helpful. That allows us to understand more about the author. And that's what I mentioned here in, can anything be learned about the author from other books? And here's where you can use a concordance to help you. All right, so this is just trying to get information. Who is the author? Okay, it's Solomon. He wrote the book of Proverbs. Well, what do we know about him? Well, he was the wisest man who ever lived, right? 1 Kings 4. He was very rich. What's that?
The son of Bathsheba.
Yes, we know that. situation with David and Bathsheba, right? And he was a child later conceived. So his father was David. He was a king of Israel, Judah in particular, right? It was
Has
during, what's that?
100 wives and concubines.
Yeah, he had a problem there, didn't he?
1,000 wives, I thought 700 wives, 300.
Yeah, so this was a problem. And he ended up later going astray, didn't he? He followed after other gods. So we can learn, we know a lot about the author just by these other books, right? And so the first part of background context is just identifying, do we know who wrote the book? In the case of Proverbs, we do. We just saw a few examples. And what do we know about the author? His circumstances, the situation. Then the second thing we want to understand from the book is the recipients. That is, who is the book initially written to? Okay, now we know ultimately, if it's in the Bible, it's intended to be for all of God's children, right? That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 or 10, excuse me. Whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction. Romans 15, verse 4? I can't remember. Paul says that as well. Yeah. Whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. So certainly we know that the Bible was written for our instruction, but also, and initially, whoops, sorry, I'm trying to switch here we are. We also know that initially, the book was written to a particular audience. Okay? And so in order to know what the passage meant, we have to first understand what did that original author, what was he saying to his audience? All right? That's key. For example, if let's say a person were to say, let's say a person said, I'm sorry to hear about your brother. Okay, well, we need to understand who is being spoken to here. Why does he say, I'm sorry to hear about your brother? And here would be some questions that would come up. Who is the brother he is speaking of? Did something bad happen to the brother? Or did the brother do something bad? Right? Maybe this guy's brother committed a crime and he's in prison. And so the person says, I'm sorry to hear about your brother. Or maybe the brother is sick. Or maybe it's not referring to a sibling at all. Maybe it's speaking of a fellow Christian, right? Or a member of a club. So all of these tell us we need to know who is being spoken to or written to. That will give us understanding as to what is being said. All right, so that's why we need to know who the recipients are. And these are some questions that will help guide you in identifying, again, not just who they are, but what are their circumstances? What's the author's relationship to these recipients? Is there any other information we can learn about them? Like I said, we just found out if we're studying Proverbs and we learn the author is Solomon, the audience in Proverbs is, I'll let you figure that one out. All right. Who are the recipients in Proverbs? He says explicitly who they are. Okay.
Sons.
He often mentions sons, doesn't he? So there are other people as well. If we study Proverbs 1, well, I'm in a good mood today, so I'll just help you guys out a little bit here. Okay. He gives the audience, the intended audience, he mentions here in these first few verses. And then the specific audience, as Kent mentioned, hear, my son, if sinners entice you. I think at the beginning of
son.
chapter 2, my son, if you will receive my words. My son, chapter 3, verse, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not showing you the, let me go back. Notice verse 8, hear my son, your father's instruction. My son, if sinners entice you, verse 10. Then at the beginning of chapter 2, my son, if you will receive my words. Verse 1 of chapter 3, my son, do not forget my teaching, right? My son, verse 11 of chapter 3. Hear, O sons, okay, plural. Hear, my son, verse 10, right? It's over and over and over, especially in the first 9 chapters, by the way. You don't see that in the chapters 10 and following, but the initial intended audience was primarily the sons of Solomon. Because, interestingly enough, Solomon even tells us this in chapter, I think it's 4. Let me see. Yeah. Let's see. Jesse, can you read verses 3 and 5 through 5? Proverbs chapter
Yes, sir.
4, 3 through 6.
3 to 6. Okay. It says, when, oops,
Can you see it?
nope, it's blurred, sir. Okay, that's good. It says in verse 3, when I was a son to my father, tender and the only son in the sight of my mother, then he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments and live. Acquire wisdom, acquire understanding. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, she will regard you. Love her, and she will watch over you.
Have you guys ever thought about, you know the story, right? First Kings was it chapter 2 when God asks Solomon in a dream, ask for anything and I'll give it to you, right? You remember that.
Yes.
Do you know, I've thought about this. What prompted Solomon to ask for wisdom? I mean, he says in the passage that, he was overwhelmed with having to lead these people, but why was wisdom what he asked for? How did he know that that was going to help him be a good king?
Because of the instructions of King David, his father.
His dad, David, told him. I mean, this should be an encouragement to us as dads, man, that, David had a lot of problems and he had a lot of problems with his children, but he was faithful to instruct them in the scripture. And Solomon, that stuck with him so that when God gave him opportunity and said, Solomon, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Solomon knew, you know what? My dad always told me, and he even writes down, when I was a son, my father taught me saying this, keep my commandment, acquire wisdom, acquire understanding, do not forsake her. So David pounded it into Solomon, the importance of wisdom. And I believe that is one of the main reasons that Solomon knew that's what he wanted to ask God for, was because of the impact of his father on this. So it's kind of an interesting little biography here that Solomon gives us. Now he is following the example of his father and is telling the same thing to his sons. And we can presume what's that?
Pastor Tim, the note on verse 1, my son, it should be King Rehoboam. his son?
Well, he certainly is probably one of them, but he also, notice it says here, "O sons." So he also at times is speaking to all of his sons or more than one. Because with 100 wives, I'm sure he had a lot of sons.
It's
So
difficult to familiarize their names.
yeah, who are you? What's your name again? Okay. So I forgot where he's going with this, but so we do see that there is a specific group of people that are recipients in this book, but it's not just his sons. If you go back to chapter 1, you'll see that it's actually more general. He also wrote to a couple of other groups of people, and I'll let you figure that out. But there is specific reference to his sons, but I believe after chapter 9, we don't see this reference to his sons anymore. We do see references to a son, but we don't see these direct. You remember in poetry, that's called apostrophe, direct address. Oh, my sons. We don't see that in chapter 10 and following. We do see it in chapters 1 through 9, if I remember correctly. We can even, let me just check real quick here. Confirm that. Yeah, it speaks of sons, but there's no direct address to his sons in these aphorisms. Oops, wait. There's one. Chapter 19, verse 27. He does directly address. And in 23. Okay, so there are a few direct address, but not until chapter 19. Anyway, so that tells us a lot, doesn't it? That tells us about, the focus of this book of Proverbs was Solomon to his sons. I think this book of Proverbs is a book that has the key audience really is teenagers. I think the book of Proverbs is the best book for teenagers, for us as dads to use as instruction. All children of any age, but especially as they enter into their teenage years, when the world is opening up to them, they don't know a lot about the world, but they're becoming young adults, and so they need instruction in what life is all about. And the book of Proverbs is written specifically for them in that situation as a young person getting ready for life, because they're in the category of the naive at that point. If they haven't chosen which direction they're going to go, whether they're going to be a wise person or a fool. The naive is somebody who just doesn't know yet. And so the book of Proverbs is written to the naive in order to give them instruction. And so I think as parents, make sure you're spending time in Proverbs with your kids at that age. All right, God's given you a book to use specifically for them. All the Bible applies, of course, but there is a book specifically for your children as they become young adults. Anyway, that's free stuff. All right, so recipients. These are some questions to consider. Another category, I call it the social context. This is a third category in the background context, and that is just looking at what other names are mentioned in the book, what's known about them. In this case, in the book of Proverbs, he mentions his sons, but we don't get a specific name. But certainly we know some of his sons' names. Rehoboam was one that Pastor German mentioned. But many books, there are often other names that are mentioned. In the book of Proverbs, there is another name. Agar is mentioned. Lemuel is mentioned. I can't think of any others that are there. But, you know, see what you can find out about those particular individuals, what's known about them. And not just names, but also nations or cities. People from, like, for example, in Jonah, the Ninevites. You'd want to understand, study the Ninevites. Who are they if you're studying the book of Jonah? Okay. Any questions about this? You guys still with me?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
All right. I don't hear any snoring. So that's probably because
Yes.
your microphones are muted, but stick with me. I just want to make sure and review this so that you can be helped in doing this this first assignment for your Proverbs passage. Historical context. Do we have an idea when the book was written? Now, for Proverbs, this can be difficult because he doesn't mention a specific date. Probably my guess would be towards the early side of Solomon's reign, right? He seems, you know, he strays later. First Kings was at chapter 10, I think describes that. You know what? I'm sorry. You guys need to help me out. I forget to switch over my my notes so you can see. All right. Sorry about that. So I had a social context here. These are the questions to consider. Other names mentioned in the book, what's known about them. Then the historical context. Can we identify when the book was written? Now, we generally know when it was written, right? About when was the book of Proverbs written? Anybody tell me? Was it written around 1500 BC? 500 BC?
I forgot about the timeline.
Oh, this was your chance to show me you remembered. Oh.
5.
Okay. What's that? I heard a 5. Well, guess what? I thought some of you might have forgotten, so I went ahead and put it in our notes. Here you go. The 500. At least you can tell me, what are the 5 names I had you memorize? Can anybody tell me that?
Adam.
Adam?
2000.
Well,
Moses.
Moses, Abraham,
David.
David,
Daniel.
Jesus.
Daniel, and Jesus. There you go. And then the 500. So you start from Jesus and just count back 500 years, right? So we know Jesus is around 0. Go back 500 years to 500 BC. Who's a common Daniel, right? The time of Daniel. Go back another 500 years to 1000 BC. David. 1500 BC.
Abraham.
Abraham.
Moses. 2000 BC. Abraham. And then Adam is like maybe 4,000 years. So most of the scripture, though, Genesis 12 through Revelation is essentially from 2000 BC on. All right. So here's that timeline. I don't know if you can see it. Okay. Really, just remember Jesus, Daniel, David, Moses, Abraham, and then the 500. Okay. Now, with this, when was the book of Proverbs written?
Between
At the middle of 1000 and 500 BC.
Yeah.
At the middle.
900.
Yeah, closer to 1,000, right? Because Solomon was the son of David.
790 to 730 BC.
That is Isaiah, or around there. Proverbs was written right around 950.
Yes, 40 years. 40 years.
Exactly. David was king around 1000, and then his son Solomon was the next. So it was the book of Proverbs, or the Proverbs were written, close to 1000 BC. Okay, so we don't need to know the exact date, but we know generally. Then we have a window here, right? We know it was somewhere in here. Okay, that's helpful. Okay, so we know the events taking place, around that time period. We can read that from the book of Kings and get some history. Right, so that's what we'd want to understand. Now, we may not know the exact dates, and like I said, I would tend to think Proverbs was written earlier in the reign of Solomon, because later on he goes astray, and I don't know that God would have him write inspired, scripture when he was in total rebellion, right? When he was worshiping other gods and things like that. So it's likely it would be toward the early part of his reign. All right, so that's the historical. The next category to consider is, why is this so much bigger? Yes. Is the geographical context. Okay, what places are mentioned within the book? All right, and notice in Proverbs, there's a lot of mention of Sheol. Jerusalem's mentioned. Trying to think any place else that's mentioned commonly there. Israel, king of Israel is mentioned. A few places. But you're going to want to note that. Where's the author located? Okay, if it's Solomon, where does Solomon live?
Jerusalem.
He's king of Israel from Jerusalem, right? So that's important then to know. What do we know about Jerusalem? What do we know about Israel in that period of time? Those kind of things. And again, you can look up locations on Bible Hub or blueletterbible.org. There's some helpful resources there. The cultural context, we've talked about that. What kind of culture does the author and the recipients, where are they from? What do we know about that culture? So in this case, we're talking about Israel around 900 BC. What do we know about Israel at that time period? Were they a prosperous nation? Were they a wicked nation? Right? These kinds of things. What kind of practices did they have? And in Proverbs, this is actually very important, right? Because there's many idioms used in Proverbs that would be connected to the culture. And we'll talk about some of those going forward. Okay, just one more, guys, and then we'll.
Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Is it the time when he built the temple? During the time when he builds the temple?
That's what I think. I would think around that time.
So does it has the building of the temple, will it has influence about his writing?
Yeah, it could. Certainly. That was a big event.
Yeah.
Yeah, some passages you might indicate that, and actually one good thing to look at would be 1 Kings 8, right? His prayer, his dedication prayer. I think there are some similarities in that prayer to some things that he says in Proverbs.
Okay.
So, yeah, that's just my opinion, but I would tend to think it's likely around that time when many of these Proverbs were written. And then I think Ecclesiastes is a book that he wrote toward the end of his life after he had gone astray. And then I think he came back to the Lord, and Ecclesiastes sort of describes that journey. So Ecclesiastes, I believe, is a book he wrote toward the end of his life. The Proverbs, I think most of the Proverbs he wrote closer to the beginning of his reign. Song of
But it is
Songs.
still possible, Pastor Ted. Is
Uh-huh.
it still possible that he wrote Proverbs during the time in his ending reign when he turns back to God?
Yeah, it's possible.
Because
Sure.
because at that time, he gained a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, certainly it's possible. But I think what's more likely is early on for a couple reasons. One is obviously he was, walking with the Lord at the beginning of his reign. Secondly, he's writing this to his sons. So they're probably, younger in age, maybe teenagers or young adults. So that might be, earlier in his reign. He wouldn't be writing necessarily to his sons when when they're all grown up. So it's likely it's earlier in his reign, but certainly it's possible that some of these could have been written later and then collected by Hezekiah. That could be the case of why we have chapter 25 and 26, where Hezekiah, the scribes in Hezekiah's day compiled and collected the Proverbs of Solomon. Maybe there were some from later in his life that they added on. It's a possibility. Good question.
Thank you, Pastor Ted.
Good question. So this is where, when we often want to be very careful about being too dogmatic about certain things. Like we aren't told exactly when it's written, so we're just trying to make a best guess. But we can't say, they're definitely written at this time. It's like saying, the book of Hebrews was definitely written by Paul and making a big case for it, and we just don't know for sure. So just be careful that we don't build convictions on things that aren't explicit. All right. So all we can do is say what's likely, unless it is explicit. But that's a good question. Again, my opinion, probably most of the Proverbs was written early in Solomon's reign. But it's certainly possible that some of it was written later. Okay. One last thing, it's helpful to understand the theological context, particularly of the audience. What were their beliefs? Were they believers, followers of God? Were they, what group of people is being addressed? That's very important. What's their theological understanding? So like you're reading the book of Galatians, it's helpful to know, and we learn from the book that it was churches in Galatia who were being influenced by Judaizers. And so we want to make sure we understand that. All right. And then finally, the occasion of the book. We've already talked about this. And the occasion is simply this: what prompted the author to write? In some books, we can find this explicitly. Others, we have to study the book to dig this out. All right. Okay. Well, we covered a lot of ground. I know that's a little bit of a challenge. What I did here was put together in a table, and this will be in your notes, just all these questions that I said, when you're looking at each category, and you want to do this when you do your assignment for background context, is just look through. These are guiding questions. You don't have to answer every question. It's just some guiding questions for each category to consider. Okay. And I put them all on a table and collected them together for you, so you can have them in one place. All right. So these are things that you're going to be looking for as you read through Proverbs. And like I said, a lot of this information you can find in the first chapter of Proverbs. If you go to the teacher's manual that I posted for you in Canvas, go to the teacher's manual, and there's a section there, several pages toward the end, that I talk about Proverbs, introduce the book. All right. You'll find a lot of helpful information there as well. Now, one thing I want to, are there any questions on that to this point? Nosebleed? We're done? Okay. All right. One more thing quickly, and then I'll let you guys go. So I updated our schedule. All right. To celebrate the new year, 2021. 2020 is over. So we're going to look forward to the new year with hope. And so one thing I wanted to do was I extended the due date for the first assignment for a couple reasons. One is I wanted to spend a little more time reviewing the background context and then the literary context. And then the second reason was just because this is going to be a little bit longer assignment. So I wanted to give you a little extra time. There's still a few of you that have to turn in your sermon for your Psalms passage. So I wanted to give a little time for that too. But so the new due date will be next week for this, the 18th. All right. So we'll talk next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about the contextual flow. And then I'll go through, I've put together, and I believe I sent you a format for this assignment, number 1 for your Proverbs passage. So we'll look at that. I'll explain it to you. And then if you have any questions about Proverbs, I'll be happy to answer it next week. All right. And then a few days after that is when the assignment will be due. And then you can see the other dates, how it comes out as far as your Proverbs passage. All right. After the first assignment, the rest of the assignments are going to be the same essentially as what we did for Psalms. Okay. It's just this first assignment is a little different because we're actually looking at the book as a whole. For Psalms, we didn't do that. So we didn't have a background, a literary context for the Psalms. All right. And then, Lord willing, in March, we'll preach your Proverbs text, and hopefully we could try to set up the same thing. Maybe if we can get preaching lab with Pastor AJ, maybe Pastor TJ, get something like that set up similarly as we did for Psalms. All right. And then we'll see where things are at in April and start module 4, Lord willing. Any questions on the schedule? Hopefully it makes sense.
Pastor Tim, will you still be posting assignment examples for this? The ones for the one that is due on the 18th for
Yeah.
the background context and literary context.
Yeah, I put together a and I'll send it to you guys. Let me write this down.
Just like the one with the sub, so that at least there will be a guide that we can perhaps fill in with our own work.
Yeah, I put together
so that we can copy and paste.
Yeah, I'll resend you the example for Proverbs, but I'm going to go through the assignment example next week with you for Proverbs. So hopefully that'll be clear. There is an example on Canvas from the book of Luke, and I'll post another one from Philemon that'll give you an idea. But the main thing will be next week. We'll go over but I'll post it tonight on the Facebook Messenger, the format I want you to follow for this assignment. Okay. And then take a look at it. If you have questions next week, we can talk about it. Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Okay. Well.
Right. You got Brother Will.
What's that?
Yeah, brilliant. Brother Will is so brilliant in asking you for an example. You know.
He's my idol.
All right, guys. Well, it's good to see you. I'm glad everyone's healthy. And I tried contacting each of you or most of you. If you, again, have any questions or anything you need, please don't ever hesitate to ask. And like I said, next week, if you have specific questions about Proverbs and the first assignment, we'll go through that. And then we're going to do the same thing as we did last time. Each week, I'll open up for questions on your specific passage. All right. So for that assignment. So if you have any questions about it, we can talk about it together, just like we did before. All right. Okay. Oh, and one final thing before we leave. If you've already done these assignments, some of you have already completed them earlier. You're welcome to just keep that assignment, or if you want to, as we review, if you want to go back to your assignment and update it, go ahead and do that. In fact, I think it'd be a good idea. That way you can sort of get familiar again with your Proverbs passage as well. So I would just encourage you to maybe go back and refine, update your assignment if you've already turned it in as we go through them together. Okay, because I'm going to grade them, each week. So this week and next week, I'll grade the background context assignments. And then the following after that.
I have a question regarding while we're talking about the grading. It's not really technical, but I just wanted to know. With the previous Psalms that were with regard to our preaching lab, will you be assessing it based on, or will you just based on the assessment of Pastor AJ?
Yeah, he was the grader for you and the guys that did the preaching lab. So I rely on his, because some of you guys preach in Cebuano, so I'm not going to be able to give input there, but I do have the assignment, the sermon, so I've been looking at them just to see, but the grade came from AJ. So if you have questions about it, feel free to talk to him.
Okay, Pastor Tim, with regard to with regard to correction or further guidance, will it still be okay to submit revised preaching based on the corrections and the guidance that were given by Pastor AJ? It's a personal inquiry for me.
If you want to preach it again for an improved score, is that what you're asking?
No, not for an improved score, just to get in further guidance. Would that be okay?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, just let us know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just send the link because I did another sermon based on the corrections of the pastors and the guidance also of Pastor.
Okay.
AJ.
Yeah. No, I'd like to see that. Sure.
Thank you, Pastor Tim.
All right. Thank you.
Magpastor na yan. Magpastor na yan.
All right.
Send us also the link, Brother William, so that we could also give our comment again.
Okay, I'll just post the link on our chat group. I'll post the link on our chat.